Thanks again for coming to today's Dharma message. We're going to start with a moment of quiet sitting. I'm going to ring a bell, and then we'll sit for a few moments to quiet our minds and prepare ourselves to hear the message. Then I'll ring the bell again, and then we'll start the Dharma message. And then when we're finished, I'll let you know and we'll stop recording. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namanda, 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 Namanda. Thank you again for attending our morning Dharma message. If I were to give a title to today's talk, I would call it Seeking Truth in Troubled Times, Good and Evil, Right and Wrong in Shinran. If you could please join me in Gassho, I'd like to read a scripture from our founder, Shinran Shoni. Even a good person attains birth in the Pure Land, so it goes without saying that an evil person will. Though it is so, people commonly say even an evil person attains birth, so it goes without saying a good person will. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namanda, Namanda, Namanda. The passage I just shared for today's Gosandai is from Tanisho 3, where Shinran, according to his disciple Yuyinbo, critiques the commonly held claim that Buddhist practitioners must strive to perform acts of karmic good in order to be born in Amida Buddha's pure land of bliss, Sukhavati. According to conventional understandings of Pure Land Buddhism, which had migrated from China at the time, there are a number of Buddhist practices such as visualizing and walking meditations, copying and chanting of sutras or the Buddhist messages, reciting the name of Amitabha Buddha, and others, which cultivate merit, allowing one to be born in the Pure Land at the time of their death. These practices are almost completely inaccessible to commoners in historical Japan. So monks who spent more time among the common folk encouraged them to recite the name of Amida Buddha. That saying, Namo Amida Butsu, would be enough to practice for one to be born in the Pure Land and eventually become Buddha. Many scholars see this development as the beginnings of a strain of Buddhist populism. Hence the statement advocated for by monastics at the time, even an evil person attains birth, so it goes without saying, a good person will. This is to say that even the commoner, who is bound by so much karmic evil and unable to become a monk or nun and focus on their spiritual development, can be born in the Pure Land. So that means it's obvious that a devotee who's serious in practicing Buddhism will be born. However, Shinran directly contradicts and critiques these religious and social valuations in the passage that I shared. He does so in the Tanisho and also throughout his own various works. Very clearly, our founder points out that our notions of good and evil, of right and wrong, correct and incorrect, are relative. These valuations are all fundamentally grounded in broader cultural, religious, and social narratives, which are molded by persons and institutions who hold power. If we look around our nation today, we're constantly being told what to believe, who is good or evil, who's right and who's wrong. And those narratives most often come from places of power, especially from our political leaders and from influencers in various forms of media. With so many conflicting stories being told, sometimes it's hard to know what to believe and how we should be in a world full of so much conflict. I've been asking myself over the past few years, but especially the past few weeks, how do I respond to all of this as a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist? There must be some way to find truth in the midst of so much chaos. While I find my heart in support of the marginalized and the oppressed, how can I also find compassion for those in power who are actively hurting so many? As a transgender person, I know what it's like to be tokenized, excluded, and abused for that aspect of my identity. However, I'm also white, and I've benefited from racist power structures in American society. In addition to this conflict between my gender and my race, I also am an ordained Jodo Shinshu Buddhist minister. So I want to serve everyone and share the Dharma as a means of comforting so many who are hurting. The weight of such internal conflict and personal responsibility has generated a lot of anxiety and frustration for me personally. But I hope that we can all work through this mess together. As a Buddhist community, we must rely on one another, taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. This is a key part of our practice. I have heard Buddhism described as an introspective religion, grounded in a deeper understanding of ourselves as individuals, which has led some people to see Buddhism not as a religion, but a philosophy. However, that view is incorrect. Our practice in Jodo Shinshu is not just about understanding who we are as individuals, though that's important. In my understanding, practicing our faith is about close attention to life in the broadest sense. We must find truth for ourselves by looking deeply into our own emotions. What brings us joy, sadness, contentment, fear, sorrow, or hatred? What are the things that bring those out in the feelings of our loved ones? What about the ones that we dislike or are enemies? What are the underlying karmic causes for joy and suffering in our world? Almost always, the answers to these questions are very complex, but some of them should be very simple. In times when we are overwhelmed with anger and sadness, it's important for us to know what to do with those feelings and where they come from. Here is where I'd like to come back to Shinran's criticism of norms in social valuation. He says, even a good person attains birth in the Pure Land, so it goes without saying that an evil person will. From an ethical and moral perspective, I would like to encourage us to ask this question in response. What good have I done? And am I always doing perfectly good? Speaking for myself, I can honestly say no, absolutely not. I try, and yet I constantly fail, because I may not know what to do, or worse yet, I may do the wrong thing. As an example, recently I was volunteering at a food pantry with two of my Jodo Shinshu friends who are Nikkeijin, Japanese American. After we finished, we were walking back to my friend's car, and a white man who was taking out his trash called out to us, "Ni hao ma." We were confused, taken aback, and didn't know what to say, so we just pretended to ignore him. And then he said to us, "Oh, no? Arigato gozaimasu." We were still confused and continued walking in an awkward silence, and he said, maybe "안녕하세요." Oh, okay, not talking. and then he continued with his task. A couple of moments later, my friends asked one another what he was saying, and one of them said they thought that he had said something in Korean. I responded, "Yeah, I think he was being casually racist. I'm sorry." Though I've heard stories like this from my friends of people making a guessing game out of figuring out their Asian ancestry, this was the first time that I had witnessed it in person. It just seemed so outrageous and rude to me. Later on, I felt guilty for not saying anything to this man, but even if I did, I'm not sure if it would have been the right thing to do. So I reached out to my friends and told them I'm sorry, that I'm here for them. And I asked that if there's anything I could do in the future if something like this happens again. They told me that they were just grateful that I had acknowledged the harmful nature of the situation and offered my support. I know personally that if someone had done anything or said anything hurtful or insensitive toward me regarding my gender identity, I would have appreciated some support. So it's very important for us to do our very best in these situations. We must show kindness, love, and respect to those who we care for. Here, I would like to come back to Shinran's inversion of good and evil. We have to be careful of the impact of our thoughts, our words, and our actions because, regardless of our intent, we may cause great harm to others and ourselves. Maybe the man from my story thought he was being friendly and welcoming. But I know that many of my friends who have experienced this sort of intrusive sort of behavior were bothered by it. Similarly, if we look at our president's stoking of fear and division, his unfounded claims and self-victimizing, his unwillingness to condemn violent acts of racism and sedition against our very country, his intentions matter very little in the light of the lasting effects that his actions have and will have on American society. Our actions all have consequences. This is a fundamental to our Buddhist understanding of the world and how it works. The law of karma, of action and response, is inescapable. If we hold in our hearts the deluded notion that we are perfectly cultivating good, this mindset leads to a distorted vision of reality that we are somehow better than others. In this selection from the Tanisho which I shared, Shinran is both critiquing the bloated egos of those who feel religiously and socially superior, and also encouraging us as Nembutsu practitioners to live our lives in deep reflection upon all the karmic baggage that keeps us from being perfect in this world, from being Buddha right now. We must also realize that this reflection includes how we exist in community, understanding that relationships, organizations, cultures, institutions, and society itself are all built upon those imperfections, which cause great suffering for ourselves and others. Karmic evil is much like a crack in the foundation of the buildings that is our society, making it flawed and inherently dangerous, especially to those who do not fit within the norms prescribed by those in power. Perhaps Shinran's wisdom can help us more skillfully address some of the deep-rooted problems that we face in society. He states in the Matosho, or the Lamp for the Latter Ages, that upon hearing the Buddha's vow to liberate all beings without discrimination, we gradually awaken from the drunkenness of our greed, anger, and ignorance. And those who have long said the Nembutsu show signs of rejecting evil in the world and the desire to cast off evil in themselves. If we examine suffering as the systemic manifestations of karmic evil, rather than just evil people, then we can get to addressing our real problems. From 400 to 150 years ago, Those in power from imperialist European countries would have argued that slavery is helpful and justified, that there is nothing ethically or morally wrong about owning another human being and treating them as livestock. Those same people and the rulers of the United States would have argued that it's best for North American indigenous peoples to be relocated and eradicated to make room for quote unquote civilized society. Less than 100 years ago, those in power in the United States decided that it would be best to illegally send persons of Japanese ancestry to concentration camps. Up until 50 years ago, those in power felt that it was best for persons of color to have quote unquote separate but equal accommodations. Today, many people in power actively choose to overlook blatant racism and uphold white supremacist movements under the guise of free speech. Those people are wrong. Racism is wrong. Discrimination and violence against LGBTQ people is wrong. Though our society allows for it, political power and popularity should not get to dictate what is good and bad or right and wrong. This is a distinction reserved for the Dharma, for our teachings. And since we live in a democratic nation, it is our responsibility to tirelessly pursue the truth and enact it in our laws and our national values. It's okay to be upset, to be sad, to be angry at the hatred and injustice that we see in our nation, but we must also be careful with how we handle those emotions. Hopefully, we can strive to enact constructive change in our society and our government rather than tear it down and destroy ourselves and others. We must reflect on who we are as individuals, as a Sangha, and as a nation on our shared karmic evil and how we might go about rejecting who we once were and work toward a more just and equitable society. In closing, I will now share with you a poem by Pure Land teacher Zumin, which describes Amida Buddha's primal vow to indiscriminately liberate all beings from our suffering. May we hold this aspiration in our hearts as a way of living during troubled times. Please join me in Gassho. That Buddha in the causal stage made the universal vow. When beings hear my name and think on me, I will come to welcome each of them, not discriminating at all between the poor and the rich and well-born, not discriminating between the inferior and the highly gifted, not choosing the learned and those upholding pure precepts, nor rejecting those who break precepts and whose evil karma is profound, solely making beings turn about and abundantly say the Nembutsu, I can make bits of rubble change into gold. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida, Namo Amida. Thank you again for joining us for this morning Dharma message. I hope you all have a wonderful week.